everybody for coming out on a very momentous day. We were just talking about how we wish this could be in person, Mütter Museum being one of the best places on the earth to attend anything, especially events about medicine. But perhaps we are all so weary from joy from the events of today that it's good that we're all sitting at home and can connect in this way. My name is Cristin Aptowicz. I'm a writer, a historian, poet, author of the book Dr. Mutter's Marvels, a biography about Thomas Dent Mütter, founder of the Mütter Museum. And I am so excited tonight to be in conversation with the amazing Janice P. Nimura. I'm going to read her bio. She received a Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of her work, The Doctors Blackwell. Her previous book, Daughters of the Samurai, A Journey from East to West and Back, was a New York Times notable book in 2015. Her essays and book reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Smithsonian, the Rumpus, Lit Hub, among other publications. And as like a writer historian dream, she appeared on Fresh Air this week. Like, the dream. I don't know a single historian who has not had the Fresh Air interview in the shower, like just excited to talk about the work. So I am thrilled to be following up Fresh Air with this event tonight. So welcome, Janice. Hi.
Thank you so much, Cristin. And actually, I did the Fresh Air interview in the closet, not in the shower. Yeah. I guess I'm going to just share my screen and get going with.
Yeah, so the structure of the
storytelling
is we're going to start with a PowerPoint presentation from the wonderful Janice, who will walk through some of the best elements of the book, and then we'll do a conversation afterwards, and we'll open it up to Q&A. So feel free to prepare your questions for her and take it away, Janice.
Thank you. All right. I just want to say thank you to the Mütter Museum for hosting tonight, and to Sam and Diego for the IT, and to Cristin for joining me. It's a really great honor to be here alongside you, since Cristin wrote the book about the guy, about Mütter himself. You should all read this book if you haven't already. It's exquisite, and it was definitely an influence on me when I was writing the Blackwells. I'm also just grateful to everybody who's here on this incredibly historic day. I hope you're all relaxing with a celebratory drink, and I hope lots of you are in Philly, because really we have Philly to thank for getting us here. So I think this is very appropriate. Because you are an audience drawn by a Mütter Museum event, I'm going to assume that you have strong stomachs. There are a couple of images in here that get a little graphic. I'll try to warn you, but I have faith that you're ready. So what is this story? You may be familiar with the name Elizabeth Blackwell, usually followed by the phrase first woman doctor. She was the first woman in America to receive a medical degree in 1849. Her sister Emily, there on the right, was the third. She followed in her footsteps in 1854, and together they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children and its Women's Medical College in 1869. I encountered the Blackwell story for the first time 5 years ago. This was despite the fact that I grew up and still live in New York, had gone to a proudly feminist all-girls school my entire life, was the math science kid, graduated with the full intention of being pre-med, and I had never heard of them. And I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard of them. But it made me think that maybe this was a story that was ripe for reintroduction to the present, because when I asked around, just about everybody who had heard of them said something like, oh yeah, I had a book about Elizabeth Blackwell when I was 7. And it's true. It's easier to find the Blackwells on the children's biography shelf than anywhere else. This is one from the 40s. They have very similar graphics. They all feature a slim, elegant, attractive young woman with a stethoscope. Here's one from the 40s. This is a middle grade one in my daughter's school library. Here's the picture book version, all perky and pretty, always that stethoscope if you look. And the children's versions were sanitized. The Blackwells looked like this. They were never photographed holding stethoscopes. They were complex, prickly, women with ragged edges. And even if they had stethoscopes in the 1840s and 50s, when they were the ages of the people who featured in these children's books, the stethoscopes would have looked like this. So there was nothing that was particularly accurate about these books, except for the admiration for women who had blazed a new trail. And I really wanted to know their whole story, not just the version in the picture book or what you could see on a plaque. So what is that story, briefly? The Blackwells were 9 siblings, 8 of whom were born in Bristol, England. Their father was a sugar refiner. Bristol was a sugar capital. Their father was both a sugar refiner and an abolitionist. So think about that for a second. Someone who had built his fortune on a commodity that depended on enslaved labor, yet spent all his free time fighting for the anti-slavery cause. He was a paradox and a dreamer. He moved his family all the way to America, to New York, and then all the way out to the remote frontier town of Cincinnati in 1838 in search of the dream of making sugar out of beets with not enslaved labor rather than cane. And then he got them all the way out to Cincinnati and died, broke, leaving 9 children and a wife with $20. And the clear lesson that having a husband was no guarantee of security. However, he and his wife were progressive thinkers. They believed in education. They had given their 5 daughters the same education as their 4 sons. And they persevered. The eldest children, who were the 3 girls, the first 3 girls, immediately leaped into teaching positions to sustain their family. Elizabeth Blackwell, born in 1821, was voraciously brilliant, socially quite awkward, blessed with a healthy sense of self-worth. She admired the transcendentalist writer Margaret Fuller, seen here, author of, at that moment, the bestseller, Woman in the 19th Century. This was a book in which Fuller argued that humankind would not rise to a new level of enlightenment until women claimed their own power and proved that they could be anything by virtue of talent and toil when it had nothing to do with sex. Women could be sea captains, she said. And Elizabeth, that really resonated with Elizabeth. She decided that she wanted to be the kind of person whose life proved Margaret Fuller's point. She wanted to be someone whose example led women, and by extension humanity, toward enlightenment. And so she chose medicine, not because she loved science or because she necessarily wanted to heal. She thought sickness was a sign of weakness. She thought bodily functions were fairly disgusting, but medicine was an unusually clear way to prove this point. It was a field that was redefining itself, both scientifically and institutionally in this moment in the mid-19th century. To this point, it had been considered more of a trade, more midwives, barber surgeons, village doctors who learned by apprenticeship. But increasingly in America, with the growth of medical schools, it was a profession, the profession of men, whose credential was a medical diploma earned in a medical school. So if a woman found her way to a medical school, sat through all the lectures, and passed all the examinations, who could argue that she wasn't a doctor? And to be frank, those tests were not that rigorous. Medical school, as this 1825 cartoon suggests, was not terribly rigorous. It consisted basically of 2 identical 16-week terms of lectures, in between which you went away for another half a year and maybe got some practical training. Many MDs graduated without ever having touched a living patient. They had taken a lot of notes, basically. If they were lucky, they had watched dissection, or maybe, gosh, even gotten to do some themselves. But it wasn't the kind of prestigious and deeply challenging field that it is now. So at the age of 26, Elizabeth won admission to a tiny rural medical school in Geneva, New York, in the Finger Lakes. Geneva College has since evolved into Hobart and William Smith colleges, if you've ever been there. She was admitted to Geneva College almost as a joke. although in her memoir, she writes of it as a foregone conclusion. You know, I applied, I received a letter, I was admitted, and I went. In reality, what really happened was that she was in Philadelphia, actually, doing some private study with a rather prestigious physician who wrote her a letter of endorsement to Geneva College. And the faculty of Geneva College weren't quite bold enough to dismiss this rather prominent physician's recommendation out of hand. And so the faculty punted the question to the students. Now, medicine in this moment was sort of what you studied if you weren't smart enough for the law. So this was and this was deep in the provinces. So this was a rather unpolished group of provincial boys who recognized that their professors had copped out and who thought, boy, this is going to be an opportunity for some fun. The professors said, if any one of you doesn't want this woman to come, then she's not coming, but you have to answer the question. And the boys got together, had a meeting, basically clubbed into submission anybody who didn't want this woman to show up, and responded with a unanimous, yes, we want this woman to come the next morning. And then they promptly forgot all about it. They thought it might be a prank being played on them by a neighboring medical school. But 3 weeks later, in walked Elizabeth Blackwell into the lecture hall. She quickly really made herself at home and made a name for herself within the college as someone who was really good at this medicine stuff. And she, in her turn, was delighted to finally be learning some medicine without just, not simply from textbooks. She was actually being able to dissect. This is the Mütter Museum's own image of a dissection kit in the collection. You see a big bone saw in the middle there. On the right, the kind of hammer that you would have used for getting into the skull. Presented at last with the opportunity to use tools and real specimens, Elizabeth discovered that she quite liked studying medicine. She was kind of fascinated with anatomy and the incredible architecture of the body. She earned the respect of her fellow students and her professors because she just walloped them all in study. The townspeople in Geneva were much more wary of her. They sort of treated her like a sideshow freak, but within the college where she mostly stayed, she quickly became something of a star. In between those two medical terms in the winters, she spent one summer, again, in Philadelphia. It's sort of a Philadelphia story, at Bloxley Almshouse. Blockley was the oldest municipal hospital in the country. It was sort of a warehouse for the destitute. It's sort of where you ended up as a last resort. And it was a great place to study illness, if not necessarily healing. Elizabeth took up residence in the almshouse in a room that was off the syphilis ward. And from having no practical instruction at medical school, she suddenly had almost more than she could handle. If you ended up in the hospital with syphilis in 1849, you were in bad shape. Not only was tertiary syphilis likely to cause, okay, trigger warning here if you don't like gore. These are some more Mütter Museum images of what syphilis can do to the body. Those are necrotic lesions in the skull on the left. And then if that progresses too much, your extremities can fall off. There was a classic syphilitic profile that people called saddle nose, when your nose would cave in from the ravages of the disease. I'm going to spare you having to stare at that. Go back to Blockley for a second. This is where Elizabeth started to make a connection between poverty and disease. Not just the ravages of syphilis, but also firsthand experience with epidemic disease, including typhus. Swarms of people were coming off of ships from Ireland, largely in 1848 from the Great Famine, carrying with them what was called ship fever, typhus, and they overflowed at Blockley. Elizabeth ended up writing her graduation thesis at Geneva College on typhus. Interestingly, choosing a subject that was not gendered. She didn't write about labor and delivery or anything obstetric. She wrote about ship fever, and it was published. But that was the experience she had at Blockley was really about putting together that connection between public poverty and disease and the importance of public health and hygiene. She graduated at the top of her class in 1849. Her thesis was published in the Buffalo Medical Journal as the lead article. It was really quite an impressive accomplishment. But then again, aside from her experience at Blockley, she really had no practical experience. So she went to Paris, which at this point was really a center of medical education, much more advanced than America. And she made an interesting choice here. She took up residence in La Maternité, a public maternity hospital housed in this old convent, which still stands. We took this picture in the middle of Paris, a place that was created to train midwives from all over France. So it had a core of student midwives, and it served the poor women of Paris, because if you were delivering in a hospital, it meant that you had no other place to go. Wealthy women would have delivered at home. So Elizabeth committed herself to become a student like the other student midwives, even though she already had a medical degree, because of the wealth of obstetric cases that passed through this place. She committed to being a student in a dormitory, unable to leave, sort of under the care of the French state in order to learn. There, she had a crisis that really intensified the trajectory of her career toward public health and away from practice. As I said, these were poor women delivering at La Maternité. Some of them were prostitutes. Many of them were infected with venereal disease. And so many of them had gonorrhea. And when a baby is born to a woman infected with gonorrhea, the infant passing through the birth canal often contracts something called gonorrheal conjunctivitis. Elizabeth was tending to one of these infants and cleaning its infected eyes when some of the washing liquid splashed into her face, and she contracted gonorrheal conjunctivitis and ended up confined to a bed in this very hospital and eventually lost one eye. A real crisis that would have sent a lesser woman fleeing for home, but not Elizabeth. I want to pause for a second here. This is sort of like a moment to reveal sort of biography craft. This was a moment in the story where there were some interesting choices to be made. Elizabeth had befriended one of the attending physicians at La Maternité, the wonderfully named Hippolyte Blot, who actually was quite easy on the eyes, as you can see. And I think she had perhaps some feelings for Hippolyte Blot, Dr. Blot. And in her own letters, he was the one who was tending to her through this terrifying illness. And she wrote about him rather romantically like this. "Ah, how dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished and the eye was left in darkness." She's writing sort of almost like a romance novelist. This is her writing in her memoir many years later. So that was one telling of this terrible story of illness. The other one came from her own sister. Her oldest sister, Anna, happened to be in Paris at the same time. And Anna was a Class A drama queen and a journalist. And so she knew how to tell a story the way it made her listeners sit up. This is how she described what was happening to Elizabeth. "The pupil presents just now the appearance of one of those little misshapen blackberries of 3 granulations and half dried up that one sees so often on some scrubby little bush. If you can fancy one such in dull-looking lead, you have just the appearance of this poor eye." So, you have to weigh the romance of the story against the reality. Think about who's telling it, think about why, and try to tease out a story that braids all that together. So anyway, Elizabeth survived that ordeal, eventually lost one eye, was fitted for a glass prosthetic that she wore for the rest of her life. If you look hard at this picture, you can see the asymmetry in her eyes, but she never referred to it. And most people she encountered, I don't think, were aware that she had this disability. And instead, as I mentioned, of running home and to recover, she continued on. After Paris, she went on to London. She continued training at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, another large and storied public hospital for the poor. And in London, she made the acquaintance of Florence Nightingale. And they hit it off. This was 1851. This was before Florence Nightingale was Florence Nightingale. And instead, she was just the daughter of a wealthy family who really was impatient for her to marry and settle down. And she was passionately interested in health and wanted to have a role in making the world a healthier place. And here's Elizabeth Blackwell, a woman who has left her family behind, won herself a medical degree, and is training independently in London. Florence Nightingale was fascinated. And they had this instant communion where they really delighted in each other to a point, because at a certain point, they began to realize that their idea of how to make this idea manifest in the world was very different. Florence Nightingale believed that women should be nurses, and Elizabeth Blackwell thought that women should be doctors in order to prove that they could. And although they had a relationship on and off for their whole lives, they never managed to reconcile themselves on this point. I think when Florence Nightingale went on to incredible fame as the lady with the lamp in the Crimean War in the late 1850s, I think Elizabeth was quite envious of this global celebrity she had and always wished that she could have some of that. But she was determined to stick with her original mission of demonstrating that women could be doctors. So she never wanted to get too close to Nightingale because that would compromise her intentions. So that was London. And after London, Elizabeth decided to settle in New York City. She thought she would go to New York and she would hang out her shingle, and patients would discover the delights of consulting a female doctor, and it would be wonderful and lucrative, but it wasn't. She got to New York and discovered that the term female physician needed renovation. For most New Yorkers in the 1850s, female physician meant an abortionist. And for most people, it meant one abortionist, Madame Restel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist. This is a cartoon that was in the National Police Gazette. You can see her being compared to a baby-eating demon. Female physician meant somebody who worked on the wrong side of the law. If you were consulting a lady doctor, that was an admission of some kind of scandal. And so Elizabeth waited for patients who really didn't come. Meanwhile, she had anointed her sister, Emily, 5 years younger, and the most brilliant of her 4 sisters, to join her in this quest to prove that women could be doctors. And Emily was actually the more talented and devoted scientist and practitioner. And she had to fight even harder for admission, because once Elizabeth had proved that a woman could be successful in medical school, all of the men's medical schools shut their doors even more firmly against women. Even Geneva College told Emily, please don't come. We like your sister, but please don't come here. It was easier for men's medical colleges to do this because in these years, female medical colleges had begun to open. But the Blackwells really scorned them as turning out an inferior product. And Emily did not want to earn a degree that was less valuable than the one her sister had earned, so she persevered, eventually starting her studies at Rush Medical College in Chicago and finishing them at Cleveland Medical College, which is now Case Western. She also went on to Europe to get some practical training and ended up in Edinburgh, apprenticing herself to James Young Simpson, one of the most illustrious physicians of the day. He was the discoverer of chloroform as an anesthetic. He was a physician to the Queen. He was a big deal at the University of Edinburgh. He was sort of larger than life. And she learned a great deal with him, although he was a bit of a showman and I think sort of enjoyed the shock value of having a female assistant. He also really respected her and taught her a great deal. Here's a Mütter Museum pair of forceps. This was what was, as men took over the business of birthing babies, as the business of birthing babies moved from midwives to male physicians, forceps, the equipment of birth, became part of that shift. Emily would have learned how to use these at deliveries. She would have learned something about pessaries. This is another Mütter Museum image. Pessaries were things that were inserted into the vagina to help with uterine prolapse. On the Mütter website, this picture is accompanied by the caption, "Did you know that your uterus could fall out?" It's true. Women who gave birth too many times because of a lack of birth control often had trouble in that area. Simpson also was a pioneer of pelvic exams and would have used the instrument at the bottom, which he designed to take measurements. This was another thing that Emily was startled by at first, but quickly learned to respect as a real important diagnostic tool. She wrote about all of this that she was learning. She wrote home in letters to Elizabeth. Elizabeth in New York, bored and broke because she had no patience, would receive letters like this from Emily with drawings on the side. If you see on the top, there is a drawing of a stem pessary, as you see at the top of this diagram, this photograph. That's what she was drawing, and in the bottom, a uterine sound along the edge of the page, just like the bottom diagram. Emily was very excited by all of this new information she was learning, and Elizabeth was desperate to continue her feeling of progress in medicine. So she ate these letters up. I'll pause here also to plug the benefits of travel in biographical research. I was fascinated with Emily's time in Edinburgh with Simpson. So I went to Edinburgh and sort of followed her around and got a better sense of what her life might have been like when she was apprenticing herself. This is Queen Street, and the middle building there was Simpson's house, which still stands. It was the biggest house in the row, the only one with an extra story, because he had so many children and patients and assistants and friends that he didn't really fit in a regular house. It's now a drug rehab center, and the door was open, as you can see in the picture. So I walked in, following in the footsteps, and picked up little details like the fact that James Young Simpson's initials were worked into the banister of the place. So this would have been the banister that Emily walked up as she attended in his consulting rooms every day. Just good details to the everyday life that she didn't necessarily write about in her letters. I also got to go to another wonderful pathology museum at the Royal College of Surgeons, where they wouldn't let me take pictures, but they did let me have a notebook. So this is all of the artifacts that you could find there, in the same way as at the Mütter Museum. Things like James Young Simpson's ivory and rosewood stethoscopes down there on the left, his pill box, his portable pill box for his house calls, which said, "Please return to 52 Queen Street" under the lid, his belt buckle, all this kinds of stuff. I highly recommend handling and experiencing as many physical artifacts as possible when you're trying to resurrect an old story. All of Emily's success was with Simpson at Edinburgh, however, was not enough to protect her from the kind of snark that people felt about the very idea of a female physician. This is a cartoon from Punch, round about the time that she was just finishing up in Edinburgh. It is meant to depict Emily in scandalous bloomers with a rather mannish profile and a horrible hat, squinting through her spectacles at the only patient who would dare to consult her, a lapdog being clutched in the arms of a wasp-waisted and attractive female, true female, right? Not the weird kind that would decide to pursue medicine. So then Emily finished up. She also pursued some study in London and Paris, and finally rejoined Elizabeth in New York, where together they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children in 1857 in a building that still stands on the corner of Bleecker and Crosby. I'm in New York, so this is a building that's become dear to my heart. I actually befriended the woman who lives in it and was privileged to write the chapter about the infirmary in the infirmary, which was pretty amazing to be able to commune with ghosts like that. It was the first hospital staffed entirely by women, and their intention in founding it wasn't just to give poor women a place to consult female doctors. It was also to give the slowly growing numbers of female medical graduates a place to get some of that practical training that they couldn't get because most hospitals didn't want women walking around. So that was the infirmary. That was founded in 1857. America was on the brink of civil war. And as you might expect, the Blackwells played a role in the Civil War. In 1861, just after Fort Sumter, there was a meeting that the Blackwells called at the infirmary of a few friends and supporters to try and draft this appeal, which ran in the New York Times the next morning, an appeal to the women of New York, and especially to those already engaged in preparing against the time of wounds and sickness in the army. And it was an invitation. If you were a woman in New York and you were interested in helping the Union cause, please come to the Cooper Union the next day for a meeting to organize. And the meeting was vast. Thousands of women ended up showing up at the Cooper Union, also a building that still stands, to find out how to help in an organized way. Out of this grew the Women's Central Association of Relief, and eventually the U.S. Sanitary Commission. So the Blackwells started something that sort of led in a direct line to the most important civilian organization of the war. Elizabeth Blackwell and Emily emerged as being in charge of the committee to select and train nurses to send to the front, which they worked at with great verve for about the first year of the war, and then became disillusioned, because what became clear was that New York's male physicians, were not interested in working alongside female physicians. So when Elizabeth and Emily wanted their infirmary to be one of the training centers for the women they selected to be nurses, the male physicians balked. And even in Washington, the woman selected to sort of lead the initiative about nursing was Dorothea Dix, not a physician, more of a lobbyist and an organizer. And Elizabeth and Emily became disgusted with this and eventually withdrew their efforts from the war and focused instead on a new project, a project that would come to fulfillment just after the war, the foundation of their own women's medical college, which was sort of ironic because they had never set out to found a women's medical college. They thought that women shouldn't be segregated in medical education. They thought that a woman's medical college was by definition inferior. But when it became clear that men's medical colleges were just not admitting women, they decided, okay, we'll found our own women's college that's going to be more rigorous than any of the men's ones. And that's what they did. That was in 1869. This is the first catalog of that college. So that's a pretty brief synopsis of their professional lives. Personally, things were just as interesting. Both sisters adopted daughters in different ways, which is intriguing. Emily lived with a female partner and fellow surgeon, Elizabeth Cushier, for the last 3 or 4 decades of her life. 2 of their brothers, Henry and Sam, married 2 of the most prominent feminists of the day, Lucy Stone, a prominent women's suffrage advocate, and Antoinette Brown, who was the first ordained minister to be a woman in this country. These were their sisters-in-law, and yet Elizabeth and Emily were very out of step with the emerging women's movement. They didn't believe that women's suffrage, getting the vote, should be the primary and initial goal of the women's movement. They thought it was a little ridiculous to give women the vote when they were still ideologically enthralled to their husbands and would probably just vote as they were told. So it's a complicated story and not necessarily in the direction, it doesn't necessarily go in the directions that you would expect it to. On top of these disagreements with the women's movement, Elizabeth and Emily also disagreed with each other about what it meant to be a woman doctor. Elizabeth, as I said, because of her early experiences, had gravitated toward public health. The idea as a woman, of a woman doctor as a teacher armed with science rather than as a practitioner. And of course, the loss of her eye accelerated that because she could no longer be a surgeon. And even reading could be difficult. So it was easier to be a lecturer, a writer about these ideas rather than a practitioner. Meanwhile, Emily was really a rather passionate scientist and believed that a woman's role as a doctor was to be just as good a doctor and surgeon and medical professor as the men. And so once their institutions had been founded, the infirmary and the Women's Medical College, almost immediately, they parted ways, and Elizabeth moved back to England, a place she had always preferred to America, and spent the last 40 years of her life there, pursuing public health initiatives, moral reform, writing and speaking a great deal, while Emily stayed in New York and ran the institutions they had founded, almost to the detriment of her own reputation. In a way, she sustained her sister's legacy to the point where, if anybody has heard of them today, they've only heard of Elizabeth, which I find kind of poignant. So that's the outline of the Blackwell story. And this moment today, as we celebrate the inauguration of our first female vice president, it feels like a good moment for the Blackwell story. This is I'll close with this image, which sort of sums up why I think this story is important right now. This is a cabinet card, albumin photograph held in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. If you Google Elizabeth Blackwell and go to images, this photo always comes up, among others. It comes up on websites, it comes up on articles about the Blackwells, it comes up on at least one biography of Elizabeth Blackwell. And it's not Elizabeth Blackwell. It's a beautiful young woman who looks like what we want Elizabeth Blackwell to look like. And it's probably one of her nieces. If you look at the back of the photograph, where the portrait studio logo is, you can see that this portrait studio was Dana's photo portrait gallery at 14th Street and 6th Avenue. That didn't exist until the mid 1880s, at which point Elizabeth Blackwell was in her mid 60s, not looking like this anymore. But people, and you can see that, you can actually see a very interesting sort of discussion happening on the back of the card. Somebody had written Bessie Blackwell, and somebody else underneath had decided, oh, that must be Elizabeth Blackwell. Oh, right, the first woman doctor. And then down below, you see somebody else penciling in. Actually, no, the dates don't work. But even still, this is continually misidentified because I think it's what we often want our heroines to look like. This woman looks like the hero of a novel. And you know what the Blackwells looked like was this, something a little less perky and pretty. These women were not interested in pleasing anyone or being anyone's ideal version of a heroine. They were complicated, prickly, imperfect, very real women, and the kind of women who changed the world. So I think it's in this moment important for us all to remember that you don't have to be perfect to change the world. And with that, I think I will unshare and bring Cristin back in. There we go. Hooray.
Fantastic. I love that ending as well. I remember reading somewhere it's like the unreasonable man expects the world to bend to him, and the reasonable man expects to bend to the world. So progress can only happen with unreasonable men, you know, because I feel that way sometimes with men and women who are groundbreakers, that a part of that bargain of breaking that ground means that on some level, there's an unreasonableness to them that makes the world have to bend.
Exactly right.
So I think, yeah, this story is a wonderful tribute to that. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation. I want to make sure we get to the Q&A. This is just thrilling. I'm not sure how many people in the audience are history lovers or interested in medicine or are writers. I really appreciated you bringing that part in. But what I love as a history reader, and I've always loved reading history, is that it just expands your world. You know, I wrote a book in this time in medical history, touching upon some of the same areas, and your book just fleshes out so much more. It has expanded my understanding. And so we were talking before about this conversation, and I was like, oh, I'm so excited because there were so many things that happened to me in the process of research and writing Dr. Mutter's Marvels that I'm sure you had similar things happen to you that I'm excited to ask you questions about. So one of the things that happened to me was, you know, when you write about the history, especially of medicine, you're so horrified by how different medicine was not so long ago. You know, just 150 years ago, to not have anesthesia, to not have germ theory, to have doctors not wash their hands or their tools. And yet, there are so many things of that time period that we still struggle with today in terms of our medical care and our doctor-patient relationship. So were there things in your research that resonated to you as in both directions? Like, oh my gosh, thank God I don't have to deal with this. I remember, I mean, this might be too much, but we're all doctors here at the Mütter Museum, but like going to a gynecologist and then being like, oh, I'm sorry that we're gonna have to do this, procedure. And I'm like, I've studied 1800s gynecology. This is a cakewalk, a dream compared to what women went through in the 1800s. And also, and in the other direction, stuff that you're like, I couldn't believe that this was something that they were dealing with back then that we're still dealing with today.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the moment in which Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell entered medicine was this weird transitional moment where at the moment where they had the idea to start studying, medicine really looked a lot like it had always looked back to antiquity. Before humors, if you had an inflammation, it meant your blood was too hot, so we better take some of that out and bleed you. Like ounces and ounces and ounces of blood because you're already sick, and that's just exactly what you need is for somebody to take your blood. And it was fascinating to me to watch them learning in medical school the ways of the past, sort of, all of these really harsh things like mercury and laudanum and bleeding and blistering and emetics and enemas and all that kind of stuff. And then also starting to take on board new ideas that seemed faddish, but maybe were the wave of the future, and for them sifting through ideas about cold water and fresh air, for instance, that a lot of people dismissed as quackery, but they weren't ready to dismiss anything yet. And that was interesting. It made me wonder, you can see them sort of investigating things that to us, we laugh at, things like mesmerism, magnetism, phrenology, the study of what bumps on your head meant what about your character. But then I think to myself, well, what about...
Whose spell collection can be found?
There you go. It made me think, what about our modern practices? What about the things that we do as a matter of course in our checkups in 150 years are going to seem barbaric? I like to think about that. It's very easy to look at the past and go, oh, good Lord, how could they have done that? But the fact is, we have no idea what's barbaric about what we do compared to what we're about to find out in the future.
Like, I think chemotherapy is something that I hope in 100 years we can progress past and be like, I can't believe that was how they had to deal with cancer. Right. Like what torture they put those people through.
Exactly.
And that was the only thing they had. And I feel that way,
Right.
Some stuff you can already see.
Right. So it made me very aware that medicine is a continuum, and it's continuing.
Yes.
We don't know all the answers.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Did you have an experience where you were sort of amazed by how things clicked into place? I know that in my studies, Thomas Mütter was the first surgeon to use ether anesthesia in Philadelphia, and the story of introducing it to it being accepted was like decades because of several factors that all had to sort of click into place in order for people to finally accept it. Did you have anything with that with the Doctors Blackwell, where they believed in something and it took a long time for it to finally be accepted?
Well, certainly their ideas about hygiene were a little ahead of the curve. The idea that washing your hands was probably a good idea. This was sort of obvious to them, and the fact that childbed fever was mostly a result of doctors doing autopsies and then going straight to the delivery ward without washing their hands. That they understood intuitively that was not a good idea. At the same time, they were also not, Elizabeth especially, was not necessarily quick to adapt to the changes that were happening, things like germ theory. It was hard for her to let go of the idea that illness had to do with sin, and that it might be caused by an amoral bacterium was hard. How is that supposed to keep you on the straight and narrow if a germ can fell anybody, regardless of whether they're a good person or not? And it's interesting to see her resisting some of those newer ideas.
Yeah, and that's an example of something we still struggle with today, where a lot of diseases that are because of, you know, poverty and climate factors that are put upon people who just happen to live in regions are causing diseases, and we sort of blame them for it, even though it's beyond their control. So that's very interesting. One of the things that happened to me was that in studying, because your other book, you know, this is sort of your first book of medical history, let's say, even though it's a biography, you had to do that work. Did that change your experience as a patient? Did you begin to relate differently or feel more empowered on being on the other side, having studied being in the doctor's shoes?
Yeah, I mean, it did make me think hard about gender and medicine, about this question. I mean, it's a question that I think started being asked with the Blackwells and is still being asked intensely, is it different to be a woman doctor? What does it really mean? Is it a neutral thing, or do women bring something different to the practice of medicine? You know, I as part of my research, I had promised myself that I would get inside a hospital and follow a woman doctor around. And so I, you know, went to Bellevue and followed a badass obstetrician on her rounds, and watched a cesarean and watched a natural birth, and thought long and hard about how she interacted both with patients and with her colleagues and with her students. And I hesitate to draw any easy conclusions, but I think sometimes, you know, the expression stereotypes save time. This idea that women are better at empathy, or women are better at listening, or women are better at getting the whole story. If there's some truth to that, then women have a really important role to play in medicine, because that's where we have to go. Our medical system is broken, and the more that we can, you know, embrace the humanity of patients and of doctors, the better we're going to do. You know, so
yeah, I think it's
questions all braided together.
Yeah, I think it's also like a good thing to remember that we're also on a timeline. You know, what female doctors mean today might mean something different 50 years ago. One of the things I learned were that male doctors were often very mean to female patients in the 1800s, but because female patients were taught to be very modest and to not expose their body and to not talk about things that weren't proper. And in order for them to have any diagnostic ability, they needed to get the women to show them stuff and tell the truth and answer questions that are not polite. And so their reaction to that, you know, would be to yell at them and threaten them and offer to, you know, say, okay, if you don't want to do this, then I enjoy dying, and leave the room. And this is what was taught. But the reason it was taught was because of the society that was created in. And you can understand where a woman doctor in that time period might be able to finesse or, you know, meet on a common ground that didn't exist with male doctors in that time period. And we're still in that today. You know, there was that study that came out that Black women giving birth are more likely to survive the birth if they have a Black doctor attending them. And that's astounding to be hearing in 2021, but something that the medical community needs to reckon with, that we need to continue that journey of making sure that we're giving access and equal care to everyone. But to also encourage more Black doctors in the meantime to help offset these statistics. I'm going to give one last question, and then we're going to bring it out. My favorite question, and by the way, anyone listening, if you're ever doing a nonfiction book event and they open up to the audience, the best question that you can be like the first person asking, because it's always hard to get people to ask, is what is the best story that did not make it into the book? Because there are so many darlings that you have to cut, and especially in medical history, there's like really like, oh man, I just want to share this like super gross or super telling story, but it just doesn't fit into the narrative that you're putting together. So I am opening the door to say, if you want to bring out a gem that you had to cut, what would that gem be?
Well, the problem with me is that since I have the attention span of a gnat, my mantra in writing is leave out everything that's boring, and anything that's really exciting and cool and juicy, find a way to get it in there, because that's what people want. That's what I want. So I didn't leave like the really juicy, gory stuff on the cutting room floor. What I left on the cutting room floor, for better or worse, was the last 40 years of their lives. because I really wanted this to be a story of the sisters. And they were not on the same continent for the last 40 years. They both did fascinating things. And there's a lot of great, some of the interpersonal family stuff as they aged and got crotchety and bitched at each other, or had weird relationships with each other's children, or just said things that made your hair stand up. There just wasn't a place for that in this story. I had, when you write a book, you have to put a frame on it, and it's kind of arbitrary where the edges are. That was hard for me, all that good stuff, and good stuff about the next generation too. I mean, Lucy Stone's daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, these were major figures in the women's movement, and they're also interesting, complicated, spiky people. And I just had to kind of mention them and move on, and that was kind of painful and sad.
Well, I mean, you could have no better advertising for a book being sold in the Mütter Museum than I did not leave out any of the bits. And so before we turn over to the audience Q&A, I want to remind everyone that this amazing book, The Doctors Blackwell, is available at the Mütter Museum gift store, which is a wonderful way to support the museum during this trying time in the pandemic, where they can't have as many visitors as they usually do. Support by purchasing things in the gift store. They have wonderful books. They have my book. They also have wonderful things like a beautiful scarf with skulls on it, which I purchased the last time. My 13-year-old daughter is the envy of her class when she takes out her little skull that she opens up, and it's got lip balm in it, and you just like wipe the brains on your face. So feel free to support the Mütter Museum. But great news, the Mütter Museum did reopen for visitors on the 15th. It's closed on Wednesdays and Tuesdays still, and you have to buy timed tickets because obviously we're doing social distancing and masking to keep our city and country safe. So there's many ways to support, but buying this fantastic book is part of it. I'm going to now turn around and give the floor to Samantha, who is a part of the Mütter Museum family and who is better working in the technical stuff than I am, who will be bringing up the questions for Janice to answer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Cristin and Janice. Of course, I'm just going to dive right in because we're cutting it close on time. We're going to run a little over. I hope that's okay with everyone. So the first question comes from Catherine. How much was a medical education? How did the Blackwell sisters afford it, coming from such straitened circumstances after their father died?
Good question. It wasn't nearly as wildly expensive as it is now. Basically, people, if you were a student, you bought tickets to the individual professor's lectures. Each professor's subject, you bought a ticket for that term. It wasn't an enormous amount of money, but for the Blackwells, not only had they earned money with their teaching and saved, but because there was a funny inversion in the Blackwell family, because the older sisters had kind of rescued the family by teaching after their father died. As the boys in the family grew up, there was a sort of a gratitude factor, and they understood that their sisters had kind of rescued the family, and they seemed unusually willing to support their very unusual pursuits, professional pursuits. They were, in some ways, the first male feminists.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question comes from An. It's a few questions in one. So one, did they have difficulty staffing the hospital with only women?
Well, there was Elizabeth and Emily, and then there was a third female physician who founded it with them, Marie Zakrzewska, who had come from Vienna and went on to be a prominent female physician in Boston. But she began as a protege of Elizabeth's and helped them. The three of them were the attending physicians. The rest of the hospital was staffed by female medical graduates, so graduates of the Boston and Philadelphia women's medical colleges. They didn't have trouble finding those women. They didn't have a lot of respect for those women's skills because they didn't really believe they were getting great educations. So they didn't have trouble finding the bodies. They just needed to teach them a lot once they got there.
Oh, wow. Number two, what were your primary sources and how did you get them?
Well, so if you write this kind of material, the only way you know you have enough material is if you're absolutely drowning in material. And the Blackwells, since there were 9 siblings who were particularly bonded to each other and always sort of drove each other nuts. So they were constantly leaving and writing to each other, which created an incredible abundance of letters. A huge dump of those are at the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge at Radcliffe. And another huge dump of them are in the Library of Congress. So that was the two most obvious places to start and drown. And then there were a lot of different rabbit holes to pursue, different universities, different private collections after that, once I sort of knew what I wanted to find.
Question 3, was there a pre-existing patient base waiting for them to open, or did the patients find them after?
Well, I think they assumed there would be an avid patient base of women wanting a woman doctor, and that's what they did not find. I think when they opened their practice in New York, they were dismayed to find there were no patients who were bold enough to consult a woman doctor. The idea of a woman doctor just wasn't attractive to most middle-class people. So that's when they opened their infirmary and created an institution to serve the poor. The poor, by definition, weren't particularly picky about the sex of their doctor. They were grateful for the free care. So once they had done that, then no, there was not a shortage. There was plenty of illness and misery in the tenements of Lower Manhattan to serve.
Thank you. He also said, "Hi, Cristin." Forgot to throw that in there. I'm just kind of diving through all the questions. Next one is from Donna. The book cover doesn't show the sisters' heads. Was that your decision?
Interesting question. Okay, so the dirty little secret of that jacket, and one with a story behind it, is that is a stock photo. There is no picture of Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell together, which is telling in itself. The decision was made to use that photo as a representation of the women that Elizabeth and Emily inspired and trained. That is a photo of women from the 1890s. You can tell by their costumes. In the 1890s, Elizabeth and Emily were elderly. But the reason we chose that particular photo is that in the 1890s, that is when the graduates of Elizabeth and Emily's college were really starting to make their way in the world. So that photo is not them, but it's meant to evoke the women who heard their call and went out into the world after them.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. The next question comes from Ken. Did the Blackwells or other doctors live at the infirmary? If so, did male doctors do the same? Also, what's the correct grammar now? Female doctor or woman doctor?
Oh, both, I think. So the Blackwells did not live in the infirmary. Dr. Zakshevska, the third woman doctor, did. The Blackwells were always trying to preserve their own sense of social decorum. They needed to present themselves as genteel. A doctor, again, was sort of a tradesperson, and they were trying to appeal to wealthier donors. They were trying to preserve their own sense of themselves as intellectuals. So living in a hospital would have created this impression that they were working people, interestingly. So they always, at the beginning, they were not resident at the infirmary. Later on, because of financial concerns, they left the original infirmary building for a larger building that was large enough to also contain apartments for themselves. But they weren't living at the hospital. They were just, their home was part of the building of the hospital. But it's a good question.
Okay. The next question is from Catherine. Are you planning on writing any future books on other pioneering women?
Yes. I have no idea who they are, but yes, sure.
Lots to choose from. The next question comes from Francis. In your interview on public radio, you indicated that compared with the cold, severe Elizabeth, Emily was warmer, had a family, and not as hard-headed as you have said today. Can you clarify this and say whether you feel Emily had the fire to pursue the career of medicine without the trailblazing by her sister?
That's a good question. I don't know whether Emily would have pursued medicine if Elizabeth hadn't told her to, but she would have pursued something. Emily had a greater capacity for self-doubt. She was better at connecting to people. She was also better at questioning whether she was on the right path. I guess that's debatable whether that's a good thing or not. Elizabeth used to say things like, doubt is disease. she was adamantly sure of her path. And that wasn't always an attractive quality, but it was actually an important quality for her to achieve what she achieved. Emily, I hold to what I said on the radio yesterday. She was a more emotionally healthy person, I think, better at making connections with other people, more human in her ability to wonder whether she was doing the right thing. They were an interesting complementary pair.
The next question comes from Janice. You mentioned Elizabeth was recommended to Geneva by a Phil doctor. Curious if it was Edwin Fussell or Joseph Longshore who were instrumental in founding the Female Medical College of PA in 1850. Oh, okay, so I think Phil meant Philadelphia. Sorry, I read that as it was abbreviated.
If I'm remembering correctly, I believe the doctor who was her patron was called Dr. Warrener. And I didn't have much information beyond that, but no, it wasn't one of the ones who founded the Female Medical College.
Okay. The next question is from Mike. When did women's medical colleges begin?
Right then. So the women's medical colleges in Boston and Philadelphia opened right around 1850, 1848, 1850, just after Elizabeth had won admission to Geneva College. They kind of evolved right alongside her career, which is interesting because she never had anything but disdain for them, and then founded her own after having said that women's medical education was unnecessary, precisely because she wanted to provide a way for women to study medicine in a rigorous way. She really didn't have a lot of respect for the existing women's medical colleges.
Next question is from Arnie. What prompted you to write this story? You may have said this in the beginning. I joined late.
No, I had always wanted to be a doctor growing up. And then when I got to college, I swerved. When you write this kind of material, when you do this kind of research over the long term, it needs to connect to something about you, something about your own identity. And so my first book was about the intersection of America and Japan, because my own family is an intersection of America and Japan. This book, really, I was tapping back to my first love, which was science and biology, and it was giving me an opportunity to stay in the 19th century and trailblazing women and add my fascination with something I hadn't ended up pursuing.
The next question is, was the female surgeon and Elizabeth who lived together romantically involved?
I'd like to think so. Certainly there was love between them. 19th century letters preserve the privacy of the people who wrote them. Certainly they were not writing to each other about the intimate details of their relationship, so there's no way to actually know. It's clear that there was real love between them, and they were domestic partners for 35 years. They were each other's person, their most important relationship. Beyond that, we'll have to let them have their privacy. I do know that if you go to, Elizabeth Cushier is buried in Greenwood Cemetery, a wonderful place to explore in Brooklyn. And if you go to her family's plot where she's buried, someone has planted a rainbow flag on her grave, which is an interesting thing when you think about the fact that when I saw it, I was moved. And then at the same time, I thought about how she and Emily Blackwell would have felt about that, and they might have felt rather violated in their privacy, because whose business is it if anyone else's what kind of relationship they had? So it's an interesting question about the lenses that we look at history through, whether we look with our own eyes or with the eyes of their contemporaries, who wouldn't have pride about the details of their relationship.
True. Next question is from Kelsey. How did they manage to keep their hospital open given the care was free?
Donations. They had a lot of wealthy donors, people who were progressive minded and who liked the idea of supporting women in medicine, even if they weren't totally ready to consult a woman doctor sometimes.
Okay, next question from Maddie. How long did it take you to write this book?
4 years, I would think. Yeah, 4 years, give or take.
Another question, was there any, there's only a few more too, so thank you. Thank you all for staying tuned. Was there any real basis for the Blackwells' distaste for women's medical colleges or just their own bias?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there was a lot of their own bias. But I do think that the instruction at women's medical colleges might not have been quite at the level of the men's colleges, just because they didn't have the same degree of resources, and probably the finest medical professors largely probably wouldn't have been choosing to teach at women's colleges. It would be the old story that the endowments and the alumni support would have been so much stronger at the men's institutions. They were probably better equipped and just wealthier institutions.
Catherine said, wonderful presentation, thank you. That was the next one on the list. Thank you, Catherine. And the last two questions are both from Anne. So the first one is, how did the infirmary make money? Well, you answered that. Did the city pay for indigent care?
The state actually gave grants to these kinds of institutions. So just by virtue of existing, sort of the way a modern 501c3 would have certain status, the infirmary had a certain status and was chartered in a certain way that it received some support from the state.
Great. And then the last question, did either of their adopted daughters become doctors?
No, although two, I believe, of their nieces did and studied at the Women's Medical College, which is interesting.
Great. Thank you so much for such an amazing, fascinating presentation. I learned so much tonight, and I'm really excited to dive into the book. If you would like to do the final closing words, you can go right ahead.
Thank you all for coming. I don't know what happened to Cristin, but I'm grateful for her, and thanks for bearing with us. I know this was running a little bit long, and I apologize for that.